Perfect. Okay. So chat is active. Hi, everyone. All right. Sorry for the delay in getting started. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad everyone can hear us. Great, cool. Okay, so just because we lost 8 minutes already, we're just gonna jump right ahead. First, I'm really happy to have two people today that will be primarily leading today's session. And just for whoever is joining us on to these sessions for the first time, we're trying to do these sessions every first Saturday of every month to have a beginner ask us anything type of event. And the idea is that we will be actually rotating time zones as we go onwards. So now we're hoping that this time zone was good for folks in Europe or folks in Eastern time zone in the United States or America in general. So that's for today. For next Saturday, the next Saturday of first Saturday of December, it's going to be a different time zone, just FYI. So for today, we primarily have Matthew Besançon, I hope, yeah, and Sasha Men. I just want to let them introduce themselves for the first couple minutes, and then we can start taking questions and answering them. So Matthew, if you want to go ahead.
Sure. Hi. So can you hear me correctly? Okay, perfect. So yeah, hi, I'm Matthew. I'm working in mathematical optimization towards a PhD now, towards hopefully the end of a PhD. And yeah, I'm using Julia primarily for my research, but also for fun and open source on the side.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew. And Sasha, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sasha. I'm a physics student. I'm using Julia for a few years now. I learned about it in a class at university. And right now I also maintain the exorcism track and some very small packages.
Cool, great. Okay, so let's get started with the questions. Also, Matthew or Sasha, if you want to just like see a question and jump right on it, go ahead. I'll just keep an eye on what questions have been answered and what haven't, and then just bring them to your attention if needed. So is there anything you see in the chat that you think you can comment on, any of you? Yeah, I'm just catching up on the chat.
Same.
Yeah, me too, yeah. So there's one easy question to get going by Sai Chen, I guess. So I get the second question here because that's the easy one. Can you comment on dynamic typing, but encouraging type annotation and type stability for speed versus just making it static typing? So Julia has dynamic types in the sense that you can have a value, you primarily program with values, and these values have types instead of expressions having types. And so this allows you some freedom that you can be familiar with from other programming languages, like, other, let's say, science-oriented programming languages. But at the same time, we do reason about types. And so you can specify that some structure has a given type or not, and that a function is expected to take a given type constraint or not. So you basically have a range of flexibility from ignoring your types and just going with the flow up to thinking about types strongly when designing your programs. I guess that's the way I see Julia is designed. And so you can just basically get started with Julia like you would in any dynamic programming language, right? Just getting going with data structures and getting going with things you want to do, building functions and so on. And only afterwards, thinking about types when you need to. But yeah, I guess that's it's always a bit of a personal view, depending on where people come from. If they come from more static programming languages, they will think about types more, well, in in all of the programs more. So yeah, I guess I'll let also Sasha give a point on that.
I agree mostly. Basically what you said, I would also agree with. There's one question how you can reduce the time it takes to load new packages. For one, you can upgrade to the latest Julia versions. There's a lot of improvement on that side. And you can also use the package compiler package to compile a sys image, which will very slightly increase the startup time, but it will make it a lot faster to load packages. And I think either in Julia 1.5 or 1.6, you can also change the compiler optimization level for individual packages when you don't need a lot of optimization.
I saw a great question by Camille Zimian. So also in the chat, I scrolled a bit up to get back to it. So there was a great discussion on the Julia discourse that you should discourage beginners from metaprogramming because higher order functions, etc., are better choices in most cases. Is this now taught? So is this still the case? So I'm fairly terrible at metaprogramming. I basically never designed a real purpose macro. So if we think about macros mostly, so I would consider them a fairly advanced feature that basically takes code and transforms it to do something useful with it. So either transforms the code to some newer code and runs it, or just transforms the code and then manipulates this transformed code or stuff like that. I would say that using macros is fairly useful and it comes very quickly. I guess the first macro people get familiar with is the @show macro, which is really useful when you're debugging or trying to understand what you're doing. But designing a macro yourself, I would not say that it's discouraged for beginners. It's just that it's not the first thing you would learn when you learn a new programming language in general, or when you learn Julia. Usually you first need to use functions, use macros, then design your functions. And then much later on, for some very specific use cases, design your own macros. But I would say it's not discouraged for beginners. It's just not a use case you have usually when you get started.
There's a similar question by Jason, who wants to know how to get started with macros if you haven't used the language with macros before. I would say just use the language and see where you get to use macros that other people have written for you. And then you will get a feel for when to use them, what they are useful for, and then you can start looking into writing them. There's a thread on Discourse that has a lot of exercises on how to write simple macros. I'm gonna try to find it and link it in the chat. That would also be a good starting point.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Julia manual is also a fairly great resource to get started because it has extensive example of what some features are, why you would use them, and then how you use them. So in lots of programming languages, you have specific resources that are strongly encouraged to get started. In Julia, I think the manual at docs.julialang.org is a really good place to just get started and get to know the language and the basic use cases and, well, basic features.
Ben asked if they add a package, if they need to add it every time they run the script or library. Basically, once you add it, it creates an environment and installs it in there. And as long as you have that loaded, you will not have to add it again. So most of the time I would not add the add commands to the script or library directly, but I would define an environment where all the dependencies are listed. Logan or Huda, I have linked the Discourse thread in Slack, but I can't post it to YouTube. So if you could cross-post that would be nice. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Logan already got it and we'll be posting it on the chat. I'm still trying to go, the questions are coming in faster than we can look at them. Matthew, if you have something in mind, or Sasha for the next question, I'm still looking.
Mohan asked what the difference between Julia and Julia Pro is. Basically, if you're not working at a company where Julia is used, you probably want to use normal Julia. Julia Pro is a distribution that I think has like a standard set of packages. It is made by Julia Computing, which is primarily useful when you want something in like a company setting. In my opinion, it might be different for others. So basically, just go with default Julia to start with.
So there's a question on the difference between the different types of parallelizing code in Julia, so asynchronous tasks versus multi-threading and so on. So again, I think I'll point to the manual for this because I had some use cases recently and I just went through the manual through the different sections for asynchronous programming in Julia. And it's all of the explanations you need or you expect are there to explain what are the different types and why you would use one or the other. So if I try to paraphrase what I remember, if I remember correctly, so basically asynchronous programming is used when you are waiting for resources, you're waiting for something else. So for example, you're getting some files reading some files from your file system or from a network or things like this. Then you don't want your program to stop when you're reading them or when you're waiting for them. So you can keep doing things while waiting for this resource. So that would be asynchronous programming. And parallel programming is when you want to run multiple things at the same time. So you want to run in parallel different tasks, so different computations. And in that case, so these are two different use cases with two sets of features in Julia and in the standard libraries of Julia. So basically on one side, tasks, and on the other, futures, if I'm not too mistaken.
Someone whose name I can't read asked how one can find methods by tab, which is often done by tab completion in other languages. I would say look at the manual or look at the documentation of the packages that you're using. And what you can also use is if you type a question mark into the REPL and then just what you're looking for, it has a bit of a search, so you can often find something. And somebody also pointed out the methods with function that you can use. But basically, the documentations should be your first stop.
Yeah, one thing I do quite often these days for this is typing the function and then opening the parentheses and then tab. And then you get the list of methods that correspond to this function name. So for example, if you have plus and you want to add an integer to something, well, you do plus parentheses my integer and then tab. And I think you get auto completion for the corresponding methods. Or in any case, you just open the parentheses and then tab, and then you will get the list of methods. So in the case of plus, there are a lot of methods, so don't do that. But if you have a function with 3 or 4 methods, this can be fairly useful to just get the list of methods that correspond to this function, and then you see which one you should call. Or for which one you should try to adapt the types and the number of arguments.
One similar thing that you can do in a lot of the IDEs is when you have a variable of a type, but you don't really know what the type does, there's a go-to definition feature where you can jump into the library code, and then that often is a good starting point to find out what field it has, and also find the doc strings for it quickly.
So there's a very funny question here. What can I do with Julia to make money? I am just a mortal. I think everyone on this call is, I assume. And in general, making a building project or building stuff with Julia, I think this is definitely adapted, and lots of companies in the last, some companies in the last years were built on top of Julia to offer some new products, develop some new features, and so on. Maybe I'll let Uda say something about this, because she's in a better position than me to speak about that.
Sorry, I was trying to catch up on the questions and paste them in the chat for you and Sasha. Was the question about how to make money with Julia? Is that the question?
Yeah, this one, yeah.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. Yeah, I think, from a company's perspective, I think from a more corporate sense, I know that some companies are starting to use Julia as their primary programming language to build all of their code base. But if on a personal level you want to build Julia, one thing you can do, there's sponsorships on GitHub projects, right? Like if you actually work on something that a lot of people like and want to use, I think GitHub, if I'm not mistaken, allows you to get sponsored. So I think that's one way. I don't know. I haven't thought about that question so much, but from a corporate sense, I know that some companies are starting to use Julia. I guess Logan just came on, so I guess you want to say something too, right?
Yeah, I just wanted to really quickly throw out that I think one of the coolest opportunities that comes from learning Julia is that, when you learn Java or Python, there's 10 million or 20 million other people in the world who know Java and know Python. So you're sort of competing against all of those people. And because the Julia ecosystem is relatively small right now, you can learn Julia and be a resident domain expert with 6 months of experience or something like that, because there's so few people who know the language. So it's really an opportunity for people who are getting involved now to sort of take advantage of that small, niche community and go and be a Julia expert or a Julia programmer somewhere. That's a great question, though.
So there is a question on alternatives like Plotly. I'm not sure if people say Plotly or Plotly, so the interactive plotting library in Julia. So I guess one obvious answer is that you can use Plotly/Plotly in Julia. So basically you have this plots package that is an umbrella package with a unified interface. And then you can use it with different backends, including Plotly if you want interactive graphics, or some more standard graphics, or things that look a bit more like ggplot2 or other things. So you have different ways to produce your plot in the end with some libraries you're already familiar with, but using one similar interface. And you just have 2 or 3 lines to switch to change the backend of your plotting system. So the one I often used, before, was matplotlib, coming from Python. So I still used it in Julia, and then I switched more to GR in the last years.
Somebody earlier asked why 1 divided by 3 gives you 0.333 and so on 4. And basically that's a quote-unquote problem with all programming languages, because you can't get infinite precision on a computer. Eventually you will run out of memory. So the default number type for that is a floating point number. Somebody linked a really useful resource for that in the chat. So basically, it takes the closest representation it can find to the result. That's why 1 divided by 3 has a rounding error. And the manual also has a lot of information on it.
So someone asked, can I use Opencv in Julia? Niraj asked that. And so I'm not sure if you can use Opencv. Maybe some other people might know better. But in any case, you have this really complete Julia image ecosystem, which is for the same use cases. And so you can manipulate images using that in a very intuitive way. So I used it a couple of times. I'm not doing very intensive research or work on images, but the few times I've used it, it's very intuitive to just load an image, manipulate it as an image, and then convert it to a matrix type if you want to manipulate the image as a matrix and so on. So yeah, just try the Julia image ecosystem and see if it fits your use case.
Somebody asked about Julia for web development. The HTTP library is a good starting point if you need something really basic, like just calling an API or maybe a basic web server. And there's also a more comprehensive framework, but I can't remember the name right now. Matthew, do you know it by any chance?
Genie?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's GenieGL, which is more similar to something like Django and Python.
Yeah. And yeah, otherwise for HTTP, there was a great workshop at JuliaCon this summer by Jacob Quinn on using, I think it was http.jl for building microservices. So it's 3 hours of Jacob building from scratch some microservices in Julia using HTTP. So if you want a good starting point, I think this is the place to go. There's a
Sasha, oh, sorry.
Sorry, yeah.
I was just going to point a question to Sasha about the getting coached, because I know Sasha works on a project related to that. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Sasha.
Oh yeah, I completely missed that question. Yeah, if you want to get coached while, for example, solving exercises, you can check out Exercism. It's a learning platform where you solve practice problems and you get feedback from mentors. I'm also gonna link it in the chat, or Logan can link it in the chat maybe, because I can't. Doesn't let me.
Yes, I'll link it in the chat.
Thanks.
Also, Logan, if you have, I didn't see if you linked it, but yeah, if you have a workshop by Jacob from this summer from JuliaCon, otherwise I can try to look for it. But yeah, if you have a link, we can put it in the chat for people interested in web development.
Yeah, I'll put that in the chat as well.
Thanks.
There's a question about creating small executables in Julia and what it would take to achieve it. I don't really know what it would take. You can create executables with package compiler, but because I'm just addressing it because it was asked a few times, I don't really know what would need to go into it to make it work better.
So a bit related to that, there was a question on, so Julia packages come as source code that you that are downloaded by the package manager and then pre-compiled before executing. So this is a bit of a related question on how can you make this a bit faster and so on. And there's also a tutorial at JuliaCon this summer on so using system image, sys image pre-built, so that you don't have this first cost when you are first loading a library and then calling it for the first time and calling the function for the first time. So in Julia, people often refer to this as time to first plot, which means you first download plots, which is a bit of a time, and then you plot something, which takes some time, only the first time, and then if you plot something else again, then this would be super fast. And so the real problem is the time to load the code and not to execute it. And so there are some examples at JuliaCon on how to reduce this cost by pre-compiling things in a fixed set of packages. There's a question on, does Julia have all the libraries that Python has? So I think more libraries, if you take this date, more libraries are initially designed for Python. But if you watch how you can build things in Julia, you can very easily import Python packages if you don't have an existing equivalent in Julia native. So if you want a good example of this, you can watch Huda's tutorial on graphs from a few weeks ago, where she uses a Python package, I think, for plotting graphs, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it was actually a crawler from Python that crawled Twitter data. So I used the pycall.jl package. So anything that is written in Python, you can very easily just import it via the pycall package. And honestly, the code is just like very similar to Python. So like it works very smoothly and very easily. So the package name is pycall.jl. There's a question that was asked earlier that is more of a opinion type question, and that is, will Julia dominate machine learning? I'm curious to know your answers to both of them, both of your answers to this question. Do you have any thoughts, Matthew?
So I'm not a machine learning person. I'm following a bit what's going on in that field, but without working in it directly. But I think there were some opinions by some of the machine learning researchers, including, I think, oh no, I'm not going to say any names because I would probably be mistaken, but saying that the current system we have is basically a way to split for machine learning between the library development and the users, which means that users which want to customize a bit more heavily their networks and other things are basically blocked at some point. And Julia was basically designed for solving this use case in scientific computing. So I think pushing it towards machine learning is also what definitely makes sense.
I don't really have an opinion on it because I don't use a lot of machine learning. Yeah, but it definitely seems to be going in a direction where it's going to be a really, really useful machine learning language, and it already is. So
yeah, I would just jump in and say one quick thing. Yeah, I second what Matthew already said about essentially hitting, if you're trying to optimize something, say from a Python perspective, or maybe R code, or even MATLAB, sometimes you can reach a point where you can't even optimize things further. And I think the biggest feature that Julia offers, well, one of the biggest features that Julia offers in the machine learning world is that you're not treating these already written code for you as black boxes. You can actually just go into them and just work with them and get them to either optimize them in a certain way that you want, or get them to return the certain values that were probably intermediate values or something like that. So you have these tools to actually go into the black box and manipulate that or change that according to your own use cases. So I think that's such a big advantage for Julia, and it makes it very easy to do that.
To complete a bit on this answer, there was also the famous post by the TensorFlow team on well, how they should write TensorFlow version 2. And they basically listed the different options they had. And Julia was basically in the short list of 2 languages with Swift. So they ended up going with Swift. But if you think about it, they considered initially a list of maybe, I don't know, 5, 6 languages, including the ones they were super familiar with to get started with. And Julia ended up being the second top choice, and the first one being Swift. Also, maybe, probably, this is my opinion here, because the lead developer of Swift was joining the TensorFlow team at this point, I think. So this might have been the key factor here. But otherwise, Julia was the leading candidate as a new programming language to design the new TensorFlow.
Nikhil asked if it's possible to use Julia on Google Colab. You can use it. There's like a template notebook that you can just copy or clone or whatever they call it on Google. And it will install Julia for you, and it will just work. Logan just linked it in the chat. Leandro asked that there's a lot of criticism about Julia adoption because people compare who has more libraries, but if it's not more relevant to balance quality of the libraries. And I would definitely agree. Julia has a lot of state-of-the-art libraries in some fields, and there are some blog posts, for example, by Chris Rokakis about his differential equation ecosystem, where they do that, they compare the quality instead of the quantity. But of course, quality is harder to measure. So it's easy to look at Python and see that there's like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of packages, and you will probably find something that kind of works for you. Whereas in to compare quality, you really need to look into it. So I think that's why people criticize Julia for that.
I think one measure you can have of library quality is how useful is the library to you. And to have useful libraries in Julia, you just need the library to work on its use case and work with the other as well. And I think that was a great conclusion of a talk by Stefan Karpinski at JuliaCon 2019. In his talk, the very unreasonable effectiveness of multiple dispatch, where basically the surprise that was in Julia was, well, we use multiple dispatch from the start, but even the developers of the Julia language didn't plan for so much reusable code in Julia. So reusable libraries with one another. And So this is you can say a side effect of multiple dispatch. You can take a very small library that does just one thing and use it with another library that does another small thing and combine the two together like they were conceived together. So you don't have an overhead cost of having libraries being split, as opposed to huge frameworks that you can have in other programming languages, because everything needs to be built into the framework from the start. So if you measure library quality as how useful it is to you, well, the library is not isolated because it works well with the rest of the ecosystem. And I think that's the biggest strength here on the quality of libraries in Julia. You can have a library that just contains one function and it can still be useful to you because it plays well with the others.
That talk is definitely worth a watch, especially if you're new to Julia. Camille asked what what our favorite or least favorite packages are. I don't think I have a least favorite, but one that I use a lot is the plots package, because I can just write the same code for several different plotting libraries and then pick the one that suits my needs the best. And I just find it really, really convenient that I only have to learn one package instead of several plotting packages.
I think so. One of my favorite libraries, I'm a bit biased here, is JUMP. So the Julia Mathematical Programming package. So it's a fairly old package. It's been developed almost with a bit later, almost with Julia itself. And so it's basically a modeling language for mathematical optimization. And I really like it as a standalone library, but I like it even more if I compare it to the alternatives that really have a different workflow that doesn't work as well for me. So with JUMP, I can basically model things in a very high level structure, just almost looking as my papers, but at the same time have them work as a library. So build them into functions, reuse them later, and so on. And you don't have that many good alternatives that have these two features together. So being good for modeling, but also being programming friendly and being integrable in other systems.
Particle X asked why Julia. There's a really good blog post by the creators of Julia about exactly that question. Basically, they wanted to combine their favorite parts of different languages together to one language that is useful for scientific computing and really fast, and so that you don't have to write code in, for example, C and then add a Python interface. You can just write it in one language. But the blog post really goes into that. And it's a really good read.
So there is the Sentry asking, so they're a master student in physics, and so they were using mostly Mathematica and wondering, is there a project that's open to me in Julia? Well, basically most of the packages and ecosystems I know in Julia are open source and willing to get new contributors all the time. So if you want to get started with open source in general, I think in Julia, it's picking something you would use or you are currently using, and then wondering if you could improve the documentation first. I guess that's a very good starting point, because if you struggle to get started, then you have something to say about the documentation, and this is worth a PR, so a contribution, and so on. And then maybe you would have something a little bit more specific to your use case in the library. Maybe you can suggest some modifications or some improvements, and then you can do the improvements yourself once you're familiar with it. So you can offer the library maintainers, hey, I can contribute this and that, or improve this, or make this faster. And so I think helping on the libraries you're using is the best way to get started.
Prashant asked if there are good tutorials on Julia's type system. I would recommend, for one, reading the manual. It has a really detailed explanation basically everything you need to know about the type system. And then also watch the talk that Matthew mentioned earlier, the unreasonable effectiveness of multiple dispatch. It shows off a bit more what the practical advantages of a type system are.
So there are different questions by Sandipan. So the first one is about symbolic mathematics package. So which one we have in Julia. So we have obviously the SymPy binding to Python, but we have different others. Sadly, I don't remember any name now, so I can't list them. But just trust me on this, there are some if somebody else has some names. Otherwise, the second question is about animation in plots, like putting a slider, for example, in a plot and see a parameter change the plot itself. So for this, you have different systems, including interact.jl, which you can use in Jupyter notebooks, for example. Otherwise, we also have a system in Pluto. So Pluto is a recent development in notebook-like environments for interactive programming, especially useful when you're doing scientific computing or scientific programming in general. And Pluto has its own interaction system. So you can build a plot and then modify a value or slide a value and see your plot change with time.
There was a question about projects that are open to beginners. Basically, every project will like it if you submit a pull request to improve something like documentations or so. But you can also use search for the labels on GitHub that are good first issue, Hacktoberfest, or intro issue. Those projects will, generally speaking, be welcoming, and they will have tagged some work that you can just pick up and do.
So for the symbolic math, I found a discussion. So it might be a bit old, but it's on Discourse. It's basically, so the three candidates here are SymPy. So the first one, which is a binding to Python, SymEngine, and reduce.jl. So the three packages seem to target the same use case, which is symbolic mathematics.
Wei Kang Shua, and I probably mispronounced that, sorry, asked, they have the impression that Julia always takes more time on the first one due to the compilation, and if that's still the case, it is still the case. It has gotten a lot better in the recent Julia versions, and if it's a big problem for your workflow, you can look into package compiler, which lets you compile a system image, which will speed up the startup time and the load time of packages. But yeah, just check out the documentation. It will explain how you can build such an image.
So there was a question by Prashant on workflow related help. So saying the manual is great to get started, but how do you get familiar with what is a good workflow in Julia? Because it's not the same as in other languages. And so this is a personal opinion, but I think watching videos for this is fairly great because you see how other people work, what's their workflow, how do they change from idea to code, to modifying the code, to running it, and so on. And so with the whole 2020 situation, there are a lot of Julia streamers that got started or got more intense on the frequency of publishing new streams and videos. And so I think the main website for this is julialang.live. And so you have the different Julia streamers, or at least you have different Julia streamers referenced here. And so you can see how they work, what are their tools, and so on. So there's a question on good resources to get started with functional programming in Julia. So Julia is multi-paradigm, I'd say, with its own twist on functional programming, its own twist on object-oriented, you could say even. So functional programming would be, well, at least for me, it's a part of how I code in Julia, but it's not purely functional. It tends to be quite functional, but not all the way through, because for some things, it just feels more natural to have imperative for loops and side effects on some limited things because it's just clear or it's obvious what it's doing at some point. If you want to use some constructs you're familiar with from some other functional programming languages, and especially statically typed functional programming languages, a good idea would be to check mlstyle.jl, which is basically offering you some new syntax inspired from OCaml or other ML type family languages. So yeah, mlstyle.jl, I think.
U2 Coldplay asked if there are any deep learning packages for computational biology. I don't know any because I don't do any in that field, but you can go to Julia Hub to find packages for everything you need to do, basically. It lists all the public and registered packages for you.
Nikhil asked, are there any directional graph related standard libraries? So not directly in the standard library, but there is the LightGraph package and all the Julia graph ecosystem around it that is building a graph type, graph data structures, and basically giving you a toolkit to get started with graphs in Julia. I'm a bit biased because I've worked a bit on the graph ecosystem, but yeah, check it out, it's fairly great.
Great. Yeah, as soon as I saw the graphs question, I immediately thought Matthew would love that question. So we're actually just about ready to end the session because we just have maybe a couple more minutes. So I don't know if there's any other final straightforward, like very easy questions to possibly answer. There's been a lot of great questions so far. I know that we didn't get to all of them, but I saw there were other people answering on the chat. So thanks for everyone answering on the chat. And there's also discourse. As you know, you can always go and ask questions on discourse. If there are, I hope that there were a few questions that were kind of related. So I hope that by touching upon one question, we answered other questions. So yeah, the session is about to end. So if there are any other follow-up questions, please do go and answer them on discourse. I do have a small request to ask everyone to do, if possible, if you'd like to, if you can just post where you are location-wise. We'd just like to kind of track where these sessions, where the audience is coming from for these sessions, so that we can time them in different ways for future times and try to capture as many time zones as possible. Meanwhile, as you are hopefully typing where your locations are, I don't know if Matthew and Sasha, you want to say any final words, possibly to capture possibly any final last questions or any other general words you might want to say.
There was one question about high school education and using Julia. I don't really know how to answer it, but recently there was a new book released that targets younger people or children even, I think. And how, yeah, so maybe
Correct,
look into
yeah.
that.
I think the author's name is Tanmay, and I know Viral is in the chat, so maybe I forgot the last name. I'll try to find it and post it on the chat as well. And
I think
Matthew?
the new book is Ahan Sengupta's, I forgot, I have the title right here. It's
okay.
The Little Book of Julia Algorithms.
Cool.
And yeah, so I didn't see any final question that would be that hasn't been answered directly. So just get started and dive in, and hopefully you enjoy the path.
Yeah, I hope the same thing. I hope once you get started, you would enjoy the path afterwards. Yeah, thanks, Logan, for posting. I'm assuming that's you, Logan, with the Julia programming language. And thanks everyone for posting where your locations are. This is super helpful. I do see a lot of people from Eastern time zone in America and as well Europe. So that's exactly how we thought this would go. So that's great. All right. So yeah, with that, I think we are just ready to wrap up. Thanks everyone for joining. Thank you so much to Matthew and Sasha. Thanks so much for answering all the questions and being super informative and helpful in your recommendations. Hopefully, we will do this again in a month from now, or about 4 weeks, first Saturday of December. And stay tuned for the next people who will be leading the next session, and as well the time at which we will be hosting the next session. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye.